Hi, I'm Michael Evans. I'm a Newcomb postdoctoral fellow in film and media studies. These are my neighbors. This is Professor Mary Flanagan, who is a Sherman Fairchild Distinguished Professor in the Humanities and a professor in film and media studies. She's interested in how human values are in play across technologies and systems. She's written more than 20 critical essays and chapters on games, empathy, gender, digital representation, art and technology, and responsible design. Her recent book includes Critical Play, which I highly recommend you read. It's an excellent book. And a forthcoming book called Values at Play in Digital Games, co-authored with Helen Nissenbaum. A lot of people have given her money. I'm not going to give you the list, but it's a lot. But the most important thing for our purposes here today is that she's a director of the Tiltfactor lab, doing social games and meaningful games. These are two of the postdoctoral researchers from the lab who I see in the hallway regularly. On the left is Jordan, on the right is Geoff, both of whom have PhDs in social psychology. Yeah. Geoff is from Carnegie Mellon, Jordan is from UNC. And they both work on the games that games can persuade, instruct through the use of narrative and social meaning. They have a game for you. You should play it.
Thank you, Michael. All right, so we are going to really have a good time here today. We wanted to do some hands-on stuff that would unpack some of the research that we're doing, and it's a really good way to playing a game and making a game is a really good way to meet people and also have a really interesting dialogue about being a woman in science. So thinking about that, we do a lot of research in this area, and we're going to share the research a little bit after we work on a game, but this is just some images of the kind of thing we do at Tiltfactor. We do board games, card games, sports, and of course digital games, iPad, mobile, not really console games, but we do all kinds of different things. And we not only make games, but we study them. So we study their efficacy, we study their effect, and so in this way, we do both science and art in our lab. And a particular interest of ours is doing games that address women and STEM issues. And it's interesting because I'm a creative artist and a designer, and Geoff and Jordan are social psychologists. But we also know the science of psychology, but also engage with science in the more hard science way. And this was a recent article that was in the Atlantic about my work talking about how you can really have to expand your notion of what a scientist is actually in this day and age. So there's some interesting things happening in the dialogue about what is science and how we want to think about that. But how many of you have played? Let's get on to gameplay, because I think that this is going to be a really good thing for all of us to do. How many of you have played Apples to Apples? How many of you haven't? Okay, so 5 people. You will catch on. This is an easy game. All right, so we have created a game. It's called Awkward Moment, and it's not exactly apples to apples, but the version we're going to play here is very close to apples to apples. And what we're going to do is we're going to make our own version of this game. Awkward Moment was created in 2012, and it does some interesting things, which we'll talk about after we make our own game. But it's basically played, probably if you've played Apples to Apples, you've seen some kinds of combinations of things and group decision making, or group decision making where people go around the room and get to play the role of a decider or a judge, right? So hold on. How interesting. I don't know why that did that. All right, so you have these various kinds. In our game, we have these awkward moments that happen to you, right? So you might see a T-shirt in the mall that says "math is hard." So that's just like, oh, maybe awkward. I don't know how many of you have seen something like this. Probably it may stick out to you, especially in your area of interest. And then we might have reaction cards, such as what is that thing over in the corner? That is not on. It's very awkward. This is not. I'm having an awkward moment right now. That is not on my screen, so don't look at whatever that is. I don't know. It just appeared like a ghost of technology entering my space. So anyway, these are the kinds of reaction cards. We're going to pass these out, as you can. Would you want to pass them out so people can actually have little packs of their own to see what are some possible reactions to an awkward moment, right? So all of these moments, by the way, were our moments, our team's moments. We collected all these awkward things that happened to us in a Google Doc, and we created another awkward moment. Oh my God. All right. Really, you have to caffeinate more or something before this happens. So there's lots of interesting things that you can have as an awkward moment. So for example, I get gum stuck in my hair. Kind of awkward. These kinds of things happen to us. So, but there are other kinds of moments that we that can include. We also have these, so you're getting a sense with the moments and the reactions of various kinds of things. Now, I'm just going through how the game is played here, and you're not seeing anything. Here you are. Here we go. So we have some awkward moments. You know, someone takes an ugly poll at school, and you find out you were number 3 on the list. Oh, this is terrible. These are terrible things. Come with us here along this journey. It will be related to science in a very meaningful way, and we have data to prove it, so you can feel rest assured that there is data behind this whimsical thing. Please do know. So what we're going to do is we're going to make our own version of awkward moment. And what we're going to do is have pink cards. You guys are just going to be running the whole time. Just run, run, run. Okay. We're gonna take pink. I guess I'm gonna have to be mic'd with this. Here, go bananas. You only have 2 hands, Jordan. How will you pass that out? Whoa. So we're gonna make our own cards. We're gonna use the pink cards to be your own awkward moments, right? They can be moments that happen to you in class. They could be moments that happen to you at your internship. They could be high school moments. They could be silly things, and they can also be serious things. So any kind of moment where you found something that was just particularly, unsettling or unusual. And as soon as you get note cards, start writing your moments. You can make several. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. There's no such thing as a wrong moment. All right, so I'm going to read you just a few randomly out of my hand. I mean, I didn't even get to curate these, but I was really surprised. Like, a male classmate accuses you of cheating on a physics test because you got a better grade. This is actually in the moment, in our thing, and you guys wrote that. So, it's really interesting. Let's see. Walking into a formal event in jeans. Good. Coworker makes an inappropriate comment while I'm eating a popsicle. Oh, yeah. Your lab, that happens so often. I'm sorry to tell you, you're totally in shock now, but it happens. Your male lab partner tends to give you orders and condescend. That is when he speaks to you at all. A lab mate comments that female colloquium speakers are usually worse than male speakers. Nice generalization there. Okay, so you're seeing some of our real thoughts, right? Some of the real things that people are experiencing. You don't know who they are, and they're not alone. And that's the point of this project, is to really start to investigate this kind of work. In 2010, the National Science Foundation and the AAUW got together and funded a compilation of what we know about women in science. It turns out that we know a lot about why a lot of women don't pursue scientific degrees. Maybe you've heard these kinds of lectures before. You know the data. Maybe you don't. Sometimes it's good to know the data. Sometimes it kind of can feel a little off-putting. So it depends on how resilient you're feeling that day, perhaps. But it was really interesting to know that in this document, which is available as a PDF, I have it on my computer. If anyone wants this, we can just give it to you. It's also available online for free at the AAUW, called Why So Few. It has all the data about enrollments in college classes, some of the psychological issues, some of the cultural issues about women in science. And it's pretty amazing to figure out some of the things that we know as in data. So, women constituting half of the workforce, nearly half of the workforce, but holding much smaller percentages of jobs. 11% of engineering. Engineering falls way, way, way behind. We also know that negative stereotypes have a super large effect on some of these attrition rates and participation. Many of you noted in the anonymous moments that you may have seen things before, allergic to algebra shirts or math is hard. In fact, after I came to Dartmouth and I was doing this women in STEM research, someone gave me their Barbie that says math is hard. So I have her if you want to come visit. I recently wrote an article about the pinkification of children's toys, how children's toys have really changed and been hyper-gendered marketing. So this is something I'm really interested in, is that this can really invoke stereotype threat and kind of limit what girls think about when they're actually making things. So there's a lot of issues, and I started getting interested. I've been doing women in science stuff since the 90s, so that's a long time, I guess, a while. And I recently started really getting into the psychological basis of why this stuff is happening. And so maybe I should turn it over to Geoff, who likes to talk about some of the research. Just not that we're turning it over to a guy to talk about the research, by the way. I'm very conscious of this. But I'm trying to be a mentor to my postdoctoral student. So, not student, I mean, you're just...
All right. So social psychologists have identified some specific psychological obstacles to participation and longevity in STEM for women and other underrepresented groups. In particular, these are especially insidious because they affect those despite having the conscious motivation to be in STEM, to have a long career in STEM. Nonetheless, they can start to eat away at confidence and self-efficacy and eventually erode motivation and participation in STEM. One of which is implicit bias. This is an unconscious link either between, say, STEM and bad or STEM and negative in general, or sort of a split or a reduced association or a reduced strength association between STEM and good or between STEM and me. So in essence, you can have this sort of unconscious erosion or unconscious weakening of your identification with STEM, which research suggests can eventually lead individuals to either leave STEM or to really have serious doubts about their future or ability to succeed in STEM, despite at the conscious level having all the intentions of pursuing STEM as either a major or career.
This can manifest as like, oh, I used to be really interested in science. You know, you've heard this from friends or, you know, I used to really like that math class, but then you don't know why. You may have lost interest, you know, or even if you have an interest, you're like, I really do like math. Why am I not pursuing it? So I guess for people in this room, you've made it past a lot of those barriers already, but they don't really go away. And that's one of the things that we want to help support here and at Dartmouth and beyond is really how do we negotiate that stuff? How do we continue to negotiate that stuff and empower everyone so that we feel like we can pursue the dreams we want to pursue?
So in essence, the good news is that psychologists have also started to identify effective strategies for overcoming implicit bias and stereotype threat. And essentially, it's as simple as being aware of bias as it occurs. So one of the points of the game is sort of bringing out these moments that people experience and making others aware of those moments and reflecting on when they occur, what are the triggers of bias, what are the sort of the warning signs that bias might be occurring around you, and then finding ways to overcome them. And there are a whole host of strategies that social psychologists and others have started to study in terms of their effectiveness. And so the game itself, the awkward moment, and other games we've made in this domain are directly sort of applying these strategies within gameplay. So for example, the idea of taking the perspective of a member of a group who's a target of a stereotype, just doing that builds empathy toward those groups, allows you to understand their experiences. So we hope through Awkward Moment, by having some very diverse groups playing it, you really get an idea of others' experiences and really step into their shoes, which is an effective way of starting to realize the impact of bias in our daily lives.
Yeah, and recent findings also point to being exposed to counter-stereotypical examples. So we'll expand who we think of when we think of being a scientist, for example. So me as a scientist is kind of a counter-stereotypical example, right? I don't think there's anything about me that seems to scream scientist at you in a stereotypical way. And yet that is a really important kind of wedge to get into the culture, is trying to find ways that we can really expand our definitions. And there was a big study last year about race that was a national call among psychologists to say, okay, how can we really solve this problem of race? Let's get all the psychologists on it. And they found that, you know, empathizing and telling stories, that was okay, but it really didn't change people's ideas about race. But counter-stereotypical examples really do. And that is one of the findings of that kind of research. And here's another one about assertively confronting and negating stereotypes. In a sense, practicing, right? So seeing this stuff and practicing, not saying, oh, I don't see it, but actually kind of being more proactive
Yeah, it's in essence, you're retraining your brain because decades and decades of being exposed to stereotypes and being either in the media or in your daily lives can build up these sort of unconscious associations. So it definitely requires sort of almost retraining or re-automatizing reactions to either domains like STEM or social groups that are underrepresented or your own self-identity as a means to counteract that sort of almost mental indoctrination that happens at an implicit level.
Yeah, when we say repeated practice, are you saying you're in a research group and you hear a stereotype-related comment come up, you talk about it with that person, or you experience, stereotype-related things, and you go through like a mental process to counter that?
I think most of us, when we hear something, go through a mental process, right? It's like, oh, I can't believe that person just said it, or we ignore it, right? So either we're ignoring it and we're just not even hearing anything, or we hear it, we digest it, we do something with it, and just move on like, okay, nothing happened. I think what we're trying to say, and from this literature, and Geoff, you can jump in here, is that figuring out what to do instead of just absorbing it. Like, what's a proactive thing we can do? It's not necessarily confrontational, right? Retrain our brain to be able to redirect that energy into something, to kind of do a move where it becomes something that we can take on. Yeah, but not necessarily confrontationally, not necessarily verbally even.
It could be sort of internal confrontation. So when you see examples of stereotypes popping up in your own mind, or if you see them occurring around you, mentally telling yourself those are invalid, that's not a fair representation of social groups. It's not fair to prejudge based on sort of superficial social categories in many cases. It is a way to sort of train your brain to make the initial reaction to things like STEM be positive, or initial reactions to members of underrepresented groups to be that they're equally capable of success in domains that they're stereotyped to be less proficient in.
Right, so we believe that games just aren't like a fun thing to do or an icebreaker, although they can serve that purpose, but they can actually be mechanisms for this kind of change. So in fact, we have some studies that we're gonna discuss, but games actually can be a really interesting way to, because they're engaging and they're social, they can form a practice space. And that is one thing that's pretty interesting about them. And they can also generate dynamic conversations about these issues that would otherwise be very difficult to have, right? Many of you would not say these things that you wrote down. And this allows us to have a conversation and a group acknowledgement about the things that are going on, as well as have fun, which is a hard thing to get to. There are other games that try to do this work. Some of them are more successful than others. This one is the gender bias bingo game. That just is another way of consciousness raising. And then some other our peers have tried to make some games that actually enact or practice the graduate student experience. So in this game, this is a game called Fair Play. And it's created at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And it's you play a graduate student, and you kind of experience the world in his lab from his point of view. And you see all the biases, the kind of small, what we call microaggressions against this character, and you begin to, it's another way of awareness raising, where something else might be really normalized in the culture. A game can kind of pull those things out and make you maybe question why that's so normal in the first place. So we've done some studies. So this is the game Awkward Moment as it's in its professional incarnation. We started off making the game just like this. We tested it with lots of middle schoolers. So it's really, the content works best for middle schoolers, but actually adults play it all the time. As you can see, it's a fun format. But what's interesting is when I say play test, so we do play tests to make a good game, and then we do actual research with IRB and the whole, Geoff can talk about a lot of the ways in which we randomly assign all the participants and go through some really interesting evaluations about what's happening psychologically when people are playing a game like this. So I want to share some of those results in our final few minutes here with you today, and then leave a little time for questions, because this is probably provocative stuff for you, hopefully. So in a randomized control study, we found that players of the game were most likely to address bias situations assertively. Right? Is this the assertive slide?
This is the measure where we presented middle school participants with a set of pictures that we said were game characters, and we weren't sure what professions they would have in this game that we were devising. So we gave the participants, who were all middle school aged, and male and female, a set of professions, some of which were male stereotypic, including scientist. And we wanted to see what percentage of participants would assign scientist one of the 3 female characters, as opposed to one of the 3 male characters that we showed them. And we gave them no other information except for this image of their gender.
So in this situation, we've got a neutral game, which is taking the biased situations out, so you just leave the whimsical situations. So it's like getting gum stuck in your hair, just going to prom in the jeans. Those are things that aren't really like indicating bias. But then we have cards mixed into those which have bias incidents on them. So we did so that was the difference between those 2 conditions.
Yeah, and the control group is simply a group that sort of a hanging control that did our measures without playing the game.
So you can see that playing the game with bias situations mixed into it in a particular ratio, not all bias situations, but mixed in to about 1 to 4 ratio, 1 to 3.
Well, it's about 40% bias related versus 60% sort of neutral moments.
Tripled players' associations of women in science. So players change their minds. Players change their minds playing this game about women in science, at least temporarily, after playing the game in our study. So we can change some of these attitudes. We can change some of these underlying things. It's not so easy to change it maybe in a confrontational way, but if we start kind of having these more experiential types of interventions, I think we can change a lot of what's going on. Here's some more data.
So this is a measure where participants were, after playing the game, they were given a set of hypothetical situations that involved bias, and not all involving gender. So we see the effect generalizing to other forms of bias that weren't represented in the game that they played. So they were given a set of response options, some of which were more assertive in nature, and others were less assertive or either accepting or trivializing of the bias situation. And we were able to code whether participants chose one of the most assertive responses as the one they would pick as the one they would be most likely to enact. And we found that similar to the idea of strengthening the association between women in science, players were also inspired to be sort of assertive in confronting bias head on, at least in these hypothetical situations.
Then we started looking at how playing the game might actually increase perspective taking among players. And so to do this, we studied awkward moment against apples to apples. Since they're so mechanically similar, would the content change really do that much in terms of getting people to really empathize or take on the perspective of someone else? And so we used a validated study that is a kind of unusual, where you draw an E on your forehead. Well, a Post-it note on your forehead. We didn't actually make participants draw on their forehead. I think that would be an extra category in the IRB of like self-harm.
Right. So in essence, this slide here, we did a pilot study with adults to see how this would work. And so we had adults playing either awkward moment or apples to apples. The measure on the left is a bit confusing, so I will leave that. And if you want more details, I can give it to you afterward. But the graph on the right shows what percentage of participants drew the E from sort of an other-oriented perspective. So when you're drawing the E, you could draw it from a more egocentric, self-oriented point of view, as if you're looking at it yourself, or you might think of how others might see it, so you could draw it from their perspective. And in general, especially the idea that, especially with kids, as we'll see in the next slide, they tend to be fairly egocentric. They tend to be more sort of self-oriented. We're seeing if the game is shifting them in the other direction of really considering somebody else's point of view. So something as simple as drawing an E on your forehead is what other psychologists have used as one way to determine if you're really thinking of other people's perspectives or mindsets or points of view.
And we saw similar patterns with youth, but not as of, I mean, in this slide, we really had 100% of our participants do something. I mean, that was kind of freaky. Right, but in this, with the youth, we had a little bit less impact, and that could be just the way that youth are more self-oriented.
Although if you compare the awkward moment, in this case we compared as well a normal version of the game where the ratio was at 40 to 60 bias to non-bias, as I mentioned. The overload condition is where we basically stack the deck to be about 80% bias moments, and we found that that's actually counterproductive. So sort of overloading the message sort of goes against the idea of an immersive, fun experience, and participants might have felt like the message was sort of being forced upon them in that case. So if you can just compare the awkward normal, the red bar, to the blue bar, there's a really dramatic jump in sort of other orientation in terms of this measure that we used.
So let's take a big step back here then out of this data. Well, we have more data about framing the game as a different, we have tons of data to share with you. But I think what this is showing us here is that we don't always have to be exactly on topic and hitting something over the head to have change. And I think a lot of times people think, oh, if it's going to be about a serious issue, it has to be a very serious situation, and it has to be a very formal type of thing. You know, like if this is diversity training, it should be serious about real diversity issues and a simulation. And that's not what we're finding. In fact, we're finding the more and more you kind of fix people into a particular way of thinking, the more they kind of rebel. People don't want to be told what to think. You know, if they want to change, that's one thing, but they often will rebel. So for thinking in your future careers about ways to have these interesting conversations about problematic issues, I think we have to really let the playful thing happen, or we're going to have less effect. And that is something that's not necessarily intuitive, and it's kind of groundbreaking, actually.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking, it kind of seems like people need to arrive at these conclusions organically. So they really own it, and they really have had a true paradigm shift rather than these sort of like stuffy trainings, HR trainings,
right?
You know, that people have to attend. It's just like, oh, shut up, you know.
Right.
Right. Find other ways to make a cultural shift.
That's right. We have to find other ways to make a cultural shift. So, for example, let's say some of you are working in a lab and you kind of wish some of these things were a little bit better. You could start playing a game like Awkward Moment, or make something, take this exercise and make your own game about weird stuff in the lab. And if it's done in a non-obvious way that's really playful, you can actually have conversations and change things. So it's not intuitive because when we're worried about social issues, they are scary and serious, and you know, we have bias and discrimination, and how do we deal with these big issues? And you know, it's a big deal. People want to be very seriously fixing these problems, but sometimes we have to do it in a playful way. So we have more data about the way in which framing the game matters, and this is something quite interesting in psychology. For many years, there's been studies about how we frame something really matters, and I haven't even unpacked how we frame lab exercises, lab work, this kind of stuff, but I'm pretty sure lab managers and leaders could do a really much better job framing how things are put, making sure that situations are set up in a really pro-social way. So, for example, when we framed this game as a game that explored stereotypes, performance went down. So, if we frame the game as exploring social situations, performance went up in terms of being more open-minded, more inclusive. So,
and in general, psychologists have found that the more aware you are that an intervention, you're part of an intervention, the more you tend to, as Mary mentioned, sort of rebel against it. It arouses what we call reactance, sort of the psychological defensiveness, especially with really hot-button issues like bias and stereotypes. So in this case, simply labeling the game as a game about stereotypes, it seemed to raise the red flag for players to not really enjoy the experience as much and not take as much away from it.
Right. So we want to wrap up and take any questions you may have. Hopefully you have some from the mundane to the sublime. I also didn't really have Jordan get a chance to jump in because most of this research was done right before he came to the lab. So, but he knows this research as well, knows a lot about narrative and storytelling as well as his area of expertise. So let's take some questions.
Yes. So you took the data like right after the game. Have you thought about doing a follow-up study, maybe like a week or two after, to see if those changes were more lasting?
Yeah, we hope to run more longitudinal studies. The one barrier we have is we're dealing with a lot of schools that are very pressed for time with limited resources, so we're lucky to get one session with the kids. But this summer, we're exploring some options. We have some summer camps that seem open to the idea, and the Hanover Parks and Rec group, for example, has said they're really on board for really studying long-term changes. And in addition, we sort of envision sort of these games as part of a broader model where you would have repeat play over time. So we might have, say, a digital version of the game where you might be able to play once or twice a week over time, and we'd be able to track those changes. We have some grant proposals in place right now that have that very component of tracking changes over time. Because as we mentioned, the idea of reducing bias means sort of repetition and sort of re-automatizing.
Yeah, but there's two other things. I was really surprised as I delved into the psychological literature that almost all the psychological literature is not longitudinal.
That's true.
So it's not a longitudinal field, which is interesting. So in that sense, our data holds up to any any of those studies because it's most kinds of psychological studies aren't that longitudinal. But what's interesting about this game, and we suspect longitudinally it'll actually have an effect like IAT tests if you're familiar with that over time. But people play this a lot because it's fun. So that's the interesting thing about a game. It's not an intervention, which is a workshop. People will just sit around and play this. So there is this kind of sense of repeat play over time voluntarily, which we think will amplify the effect, but that's just a hypothesis. Yeah, in the back, and then we'll go to...
How might these results compare when people play cards against humanity?
Funny you should say that. We can't talk about that right now. It's another game. It's a commercial game that's like this, but you do evil things. You do evil things.
And we may or may not be studying that game currently.
So my question was about like the goal of the game. So it seems like this game is really related to awareness, like, oh, this moment is awkward when like a boy says that you should have done the whole thing. But it doesn't really seem to address the idea of like, okay, how to appropriately respond, because like one of our causes is like right here, local congressperson, which like you probably wouldn't do in real life if you're like not such a biased person. Right. So like how do you counter that with like what you're trying to achieve, or is this game just about awareness and not like teaching appropriate ways to deal with bias, especially if you're not receiving it?
It's certainly not training. It's not a training game, right? It's trying to affect implicit, unconscious psychological changes, not about training. So that would be a different game or a different thing to do. It's hard to do some of that stuff if it's really literal as a game. Some things are just better as a in-person training thing. Although I'm not, so that's my response. We're really working on this kind of subconscious psychological level. I kind of see this as this iceberg model, right? Like the stuff we see, the bias incidents, are part of this huge morass of unconscious assumptions that go across different kinds of culture formation. So we're really working on the culture part first.
And also, one component of the game we didn't cover today, the actual game, there's another card into the mix called the Decider card that gives a guideline for picking a winning answer, and that sets constraints. So some of them actually say most appropriate or least appropriate, or what a teacher would tell you to do versus what a best friend would tell you to do. And so in the game itself, there are these moments to reflect on, well, what's an appropriate response, or what's a more effective or practical response? What's an absurd or ridiculous response, as a way to really add another layer of really analyzing the reactions and thinking about what effect they might have if you actually enacted them in real life.
Any other questions?
No, yeah, I think this game does a good job at sort of like breaking the ice and getting people to laugh about this really, really serious issue. Because sometimes it becomes so serious that people are afraid to even talk about it because it becomes such a politically sensitive subject. And once we need to kind of move away a little bit from that political sensitivity, because it's gotten to the point where it caps progress, because we're all afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Right.
And there are people out there who genuinely want to get to the bottom of it, but maybe it's a male in my lab group and he doesn't know how to broach the subject with me because it's become such a politically sensitive subject. And so if there's a way we can break the ice, and this would be another
tool for that. Yeah. I'll go to the back and then come on.
So my question, I'm thrilled to see this whole presentation. With the Women in Science Project, we've been here for a long time. Are you working with HR here at Dartmouth? How are these games getting into the Dartmouth culture? How are you trying to help the problem?
Well, we have another version of this coming called Awkward Moment at Work, and we have worked directly with the HR department. There's not a lot of mechanism for our administration to really work with faculty research. It's weird.
Well, except like DCAP training, with science, there's a great science teaching seminar, for example.
No one's, I don't know. I mean, no one's, go nuts with that. That's great. We do have, we have another game called Buffalo, which does some interesting stuff about prejudice and interpersonal relationships, and it's another like kind of party game thing. And that one has been used at when the freshmen come like the admissions office actually uses Buffalo as part of the.
Yeah, and we have copies of Awkward Moment in Buffalo at some of the cabins where some of the trips go to.
Right, the trips. But what's interesting is these are sold as commercial party games without the whole women in science thing. So they're actually kind of just like out there as products without without the label, because if the label will kill it.
I think we need to wrap up, Mary.
One more question.
Okay.
So continuing on that, can I get one of those for my lab?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you
Yes.
guys sell them there at the Tiltfactor?
No, we don't sell them, but there's an online retailer who sells them. And we have some, demo models as well. But if you want to, just Uncommon Goods sells them. Yeah. Tiltfactor has a pretty kind of big website with all of our stuff on it, including our research papers. So I encourage you to look at tiltfactor.org. We have our studios over in the Black Family Visual Arts Center. And thank you so much for playing Awkward Moment. We're going to collect the cards as you guys go on break so that we're not throwing all the moments all over. But thank you so much for your attention and your playful attitudes and your awkwardness.